It was a quiet, humid night in rural Texas, the kind of night where the crickets sing their steady lullaby and the wind moves so lazily that even the leaves seem to sleep. In a modest single-story house nestled off a long dirt road, Eleanor Fairchild, known by neighbors as Granny, had already gone to bed. At 75 years old, Eleanor lived alone after her husband passed a few years prior, and despite her age, she managed her little ranch with a grit that only decades of hard living could forge. A retired school teacher, she was respected in her community, not just for her kindness, but for her toughness. Everyone knew Granny didn't scare easy. And if you looked closely enough, you'd see the .38 special revolver resting faithfully in the drawer by her bed. Not for decoration, not for show, just in case. That night Eleanor had gone to sleep with her Bible on the nightstand, her glasses folded beside it, and the fan turning slowly above her. She wasn't expecting anything unusual, but at 2:47 a.m., something unusual found her. A sound, faint at first, the rustle of dry leaves outside, a crunch, then silence. Eleanor opened one eye. Her instincts, honed from years of raising kids and living far from help, told her something was off. She sat up slowly, heart already beating a little faster. She listened again. Another crunch. Heavier this time. Closer. Not a deer. Not a raccoon. Something with purpose. She slid her feet into her slippers and with practiced ease, opened the drawer. The cold grip of the .38 met her hand like an old friend. In the pitch darkness, she moved quietly across her wooden floor, every step deliberate. She didn't switch on any lights. Granny knew better. Lights give away your position. Instead, she relied on her memory of the house. A creaky board near the hallway. Avoid that. A table corner jutting into the path. Step around. She crept to the edge of the living room, barely breathing now. That's when she heard it. The distinct, unmistakable sound of glass shattering in the kitchen. They were inside. Two of them. She didn't know who or why, but she could hear the muffled voices. Whispering. Arguing. One of them laughed, a low, sinister chuckle that made Eleanor's stomach knot. These weren't just thieves. They were the kind that didn't care who got in the way. But Eleanor had made a promise to herself long ago after her husband died. She wouldn't go out scared. Not in her own home. Not in her own damn kitchen. So she waited. In the dark. Eyes locked on the hallway entrance. Finger resting gently on the trigger. Every sense sharpened. And then, footsteps. Getting closer. The footsteps echoed louder with each passing second, and Eleanor's grip on the revolver tightened. Her breathing slowed. Her pulse, steady now, throbbed in her ears like a drumbeat of focus. This wasn't fear. It was readiness. She'd taught generations of students how to handle pressure, how to think clearly in chaos. Now she would teach two criminals a lesson they'd never forget, if they survived it. One of the men stepped into the hallway, his silhouette dimly visible in the pale moonlight filtering through the kitchen window. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, and holding something, maybe a crowbar. His companion was just behind, shorter, thicker, muttering curses under his breath as they crept forward, oblivious to the storm waiting around the corner. Eleanor took one step back, just enough to give her a wider angle. She knew she had only one chance. One wrong move, and this wouldn't end in her favor. But Granny didn't flinch. She never did. The taller man turned toward the living room, scanning the shadows. His eyes hadn't adjusted. He saw nothing. She saw everything. "Don't move," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. The men froze. One barked a confused, "What the?" Just as Eleanor raised the revolver and fired. The shot was deafening in the tight space, echoing off the walls like a thunderclap. The first man fell instantly. His knees buckled as he hit the hardwood floor with a sickening thud. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading fast. The second man shouted in panic, bolting toward the kitchen in a blind dash, but Granny was already moving. Her years may have slowed her step, but not her will. She followed quickly, aiming again. The second shot hit the man in the side as he reached the back door. He screamed, stumbling out into the yard, disappearing into the night like a wounded animal. Then silence again. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, revolver still raised, staring at the open door. The breeze crept in through the frame, cool against her face. The crickets had gone quiet. Time seemed to pause. Only then did she lower the weapon. It was over, or at least, that's what she thought. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the night. A neighbor, awakened by the gunshots, had already called 911. Eleanor placed the gun gently on the table, sat down, and waited, her hands steady, her mind sharp. She knew what was coming next. The questions, the judgment, the headlines. But none of it mattered to her. All that mattered was that she was still alive, and that evil had not found a home in her house tonight. When the flashing red and blue lights finally cut through the rural darkness, Eleanor Fairchild was sitting on her porch, as if nothing had happened. Her silver hair was slightly disheveled, her floral nightgown spotted with flecks of blood, none of it her own. She looked like any other sweet grandmother, quietly sipping from a chipped ceramic mug. Except this wasn't tea. It was ice water, poured with hands that had just pulled a trigger twice. The sheriff's deputies pulled up fast, 4 cars in total. Guns drawn, shouts flying into the night. "Hands up! Drop any weapons!" Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply raised both hands slowly and said, "The gun's inside. I'm not going to shoot anybody else tonight." They weren't sure what to make of her at first. But then they saw the body, sprawled in the hallway, motionless, the blood already congealing around the man's head. A paramedic knelt beside him, checked once, then shook his head. The second intruder had vanished into the woods, bleeding but alive. And that made Eleanor's case even more unusual, because she'd left a witness behind. A criminal, yes, but a man who could speak, who could tell his side of the story. Inside the house, officers moved through slowly, flashlights illuminating shattered glass, muddy footprints, and the long trail of blood leading out the back. They saw Eleanor's bed neatly made, the Bible undisturbed, the open drawer where the .38 rested. Detective Mark Benton, a veteran with 25 years on the force, took one look around and muttered, "Hell of a scene." He found Eleanor back on the porch, calm as ever. "You know we're gonna have to take your statement, ma'am." She nodded. "Already figured." In the cruiser on the way to the station, Eleanor said very little, but what she did say made an impression. "They didn't just break into my home. They broke into my peace, and I don't let anyone take that from me." By morning, the story had already begun to spread. A 75-year-old woman shoots 2 intruders, kills one, chases the other off her property. Reporters descended on the sleepy Texas town like vultures, eager for a soundbite. Some praised her. Others whispered about vigilantism. Was it justified? One anchor asked on a national morning show. Was it brave or reckless? Eleanor didn't care. The hospital confirmed the second intruder had been found and was in custody, undergoing surgery. Authorities identified the men as career criminals, responsible for a string of burglaries across the region. Neither had expected resistance, especially not from someone their grandmother's age. But they hadn't met Eleanor Fairchild. By sundown, her porch was covered with flowers, cards, handwritten notes from strangers. Some called her a hero, others simply called her brave. And inside, Eleanor sat in her kitchen, staring out the window, the .38 now locked away. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd done what had to be done. But something inside her had shifted. The world now knew her name, and she would never be just Granny again. By the end of the week, Eleanor's quiet life had been turned completely inside out. Satellite vans lined the dirt road leading to her house, Reporters stood outside in perfectly ironed suits, rehearsing sound bites in front of cameras. "Granny Gunslinger," one local channel dubbed her. Another headline screamed across morning papers. "Vanished, criminals break in, only one walks out, wounded by a grandmother's gun." Eleanor had become a sensation, reluctantly. But the fame came with more than just curiosity. Strangers began stopping by unannounced, hoping for a selfie, a quote, or just to lay eyes on the woman who had turned the tide against two armed men. Some brought casseroles, others flags. One man traveled from 3 states over just to shake her hand and say, "You give us hope." Eleanor didn't know what to make of it. She'd spent most of her life avoiding attention. Now it was inescapable. Talk shows called. News anchors asked for exclusives. Social media lit up with images of her holding her revolver, though she'd never posed for any of them. Most were fabricated, digitally manipulated to show her as some kind of action hero, standing tall in a burning house, or with eagles flying behind her. The real Eleanor just shook her head. "People believe anything they see on a screen," she muttered. But with the attention also came something darker. Not everyone celebrated her actions. She began receiving letters, some anonymous, some signed, accusing her of being a murderer. "You had no right to play judge, jury, and executioner," one note read. Another warned, "Karma finds everyone, even sweet old ladies." The sheriff increased patrols around her property. A camera was installed over her porch, but Eleanor didn't scare easily. Still, there were nights when the silence no longer brought peace. Nights when the sound of footsteps, real or imagined, woke her from dreams that always ended with that first deafening gunshot. One afternoon, she stood in front of a small mirror in her hallway. The woman staring back was still Eleanor Fairchild, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, but now she carried a weight in her shoulders, a knowledge she hadn't possessed before. She had taken a life. And even if it was justified, even if it had saved her own, it wasn't something to be worn lightly. She turned away from the mirror. Behind her, the mail piled up again. More reporters waited at the end of the drive. And somewhere, in a county jail not far away, the man who'd fled into the woods that night was recovering and speaking. And what he said next would make everything worse. His name was Marcus Reddick, 32 years old, with a long criminal record and no shortage of lies behind him. But when the press got word that he was talking, the headlines exploded again. From inside his hospital bed, flanked by 2 armed deputies, Marcus gave a statement that twisted the narrative on its head. He claimed he and his partner hadn't gone to rob the house. According to him, they thought it was abandoned. "We didn't know anyone was inside," he said. "We weren't there to hurt nobody." He painted Eleanor not as a brave defender of her home, but as a trigger-happy vigilante who fired without warning. "We were leaving," he said, "and she shot us in the back." He didn't cry, but his voice cracked, just enough to sound human to a camera. That clip went viral. Overnight, opinion shifted. Internet forums, news anchors, even legal analysts began to ask, had Eleanor Fairchild really acted in self-defense? Her image, once glorified, began to erode. Cable news ran side-by-side comparisons of Marcus's injuries and the position of the body inside Eleanor's home. Diagrams, timelines, conjecture. One commentator said, "This might not be a simple stand-your-ground case after all." Another said, "We need to be very careful before we crown anyone a hero." The sheriff's office responded swiftly. Evidence showed forced entry. Blood trails confirmed Marcus had been shot while still inside the home. The recovered crowbar had Eleanor's front door paint on it. But the truth didn't travel as fast as the doubt, and the doubt was brutal. Eleanor received her first death threat 2 days after Marcus's interview aired. "Hope someone teaches you a lesson, old woman," it read. Another caller left a voicemail. "You won't be so tough when it's your turn to vanish." The threats were forwarded to authorities, but the damage was done. She began sleeping with her revolver once more, now fully loaded and never in a drawer. Friends who had praised her began to avoid her. Some neighbors stopped waving. One parent pulled their child out of Eleanor's old Sunday school class at church. The press, once camped out for a glimpse of Granny the hero, now wanted a quote from the shooter. Eleanor stayed silent. She gave no interviews. She didn't refute Marcus's claims publicly. But in private, she burned with quiet fury, because she knew the truth. She remembered the sound of the glass breaking, the way the men moved, the weapon in the tall one's hand. She remembered the laughter, the threat, the way her heart had pounded, not with anger, but with clarity. She had protected her life, her home, her story. But now it was slipping away from her, rewritten by someone who hadn't even had the courage to face her after the fact. Something had to be done. And Eleanor Fairchild wasn't finished yet. Eleanor didn't want to be famous. She didn't want her face on television, or her name argued over by people who'd never walked through her door. But when the district attorney called and said Marcus Reddick had filed a civil lawsuit for excessive force, she knew it was time to stop being silent. The case wasn't criminal, she wasn't being charged, but the court of public opinion had already put her on trial. And now, a real courtroom would do the same. She arrived in silence, dressed in a dark blue suit that had belonged to her husband, tailored down to fit her smaller frame. No makeup, no fanfare, just steel in her eyes and something resolute in the way she walked. The gallery was packed, journalists, activists, even old students of hers from decades ago. Some there to support her, others just curious to see how it all would unfold. Marcus sat across from her, dressed in a crisp shirt, arm in a sling, surrounded by lawyers. He didn't look like the man who'd broken into her home. He looked like someone's son, someone's victim. But Eleanor knew better. The attorneys painted contrasting portraits. Marcus's legal team called her reckless, impatient, and overzealous. They said she'd escalated the situation, fired without assessing the threat, and violated the sanctity of life, even a criminal's. He was retreating, they claimed. She was hunting. Eleanor's defense was firm, quiet, and devastating. The sheriff testified about the forced entry. The medical examiner confirmed the trajectory of the bullets, both fired while the men were inside. The 911 call, captured by a neighbor's emergency line, picked up Eleanor's warning, "Don't move." And then Eleanor took the stand. There was no dramatic speech, no tears. She answered every question with clarity, each word measured like a schoolteacher correcting a lesson. "Did you intend to kill them?" the prosecutor asked. "I intended to survive," she replied. "Did you know they were leaving?" "I didn't know what they were doing. I knew they weren't invited." The courtroom fell silent at that. No whisper, no camera clicks. Then she looked directly at Marcus. "You didn't vanish that night," she said. "You ran. You lived. And now you're trying to erase the part where you chose to break in." Her words hung in the air like smoke. When the testimony ended, Eleanor stepped down slowly, back straight, shoulders set. She wasn't there to convince the world. She was there to speak her truth. And in that moment, the tide turned. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. It was a civil case, but the stakes felt heavier than money. It was Eleanor Fairchild's name, her life, her truth hanging in the balance. As they filed back into the courtroom, the tension was razor sharp. Cameras rolled, reporters whispered. Marcus sat rigid in his chair, his lawyers stone-faced. Eleanor sat still, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for church to start. The verdict, not liable. The room exhaled. Eleanor didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded as if to say, "Of course, I was there. I know what happened." Outside the courthouse, a swarm of reporters waited for a statement. She gave them 5 words. I stood my ground. Period. And with that, she walked away. But the story didn't vanish. Documentaries came calling. Book deals were offered. A streaming service pitched a mini-series about her life. Hollywood saw a gold mine in Granny with a gun. She turned them all down. This wasn't entertainment, she told one producer. It was survival. Despite the public's shifting gaze, Eleanor was still deeply changed. At night, she sometimes sat by the back door, eyes scanning the tree line beyond her yard. She wasn't afraid of another break-in. She was afraid of losing the version of herself that existed before that night. The version who didn't see shadows in every sound, who didn't listen for footsteps at 2:47 a.m. But healing came in strange, quiet ways. A woman from a nearby county wrote her a letter. "My husband used to beat me. I never had the courage to leave until I saw your story. You reminded me I could fight back." A man from Louisiana sent a photo of his grandmother holding a small revolver, smiling proudly with a caption, "She's got one now too. You're our hero." Eleanor kept the letters in a shoebox beneath her bed, beside the revolver. Not as trophies, but as reminders that what happened that night didn't just save her. It sent out a signal, a warning, a message. Not all victims are helpless, but there was still one final echo left to face. Marcus Reddick was convicted on multiple counts of burglary, weapons possession, and obstruction of justice. But before his sentencing, he asked to speak. In court, he looked at Eleanor, this time not as a defendant or a liar, but as a man who had lost. "I didn't think you'd fight back," he said. "I didn't think you'd be the one to end it." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because some men vanish into the night with a gunshot, and some vanish because a woman stood her ground. Years passed. The cameras left. The headlines faded. New scandals, new tragedies, new heroes took their place in the collective memory. But in that small Texas town, Eleanor Fairchild remained a quiet, steady presence. Not a celebrity, not a recluse, just a woman who'd faced the darkness, and won. Her home looked the same from the outside. The old rocking chair still sat on the porch. The paint peeled a little more each summer. The wind still whispered through the trees at night. But inside, things had changed. Eleanor had changed. She no longer kept the .38 in the drawer. It now rested in a locked case, high on a shelf, with a note taped to it that read, "Only if I must." She still walked the halls at night sometimes, her bare feet brushing the old wood floors, listening. Not for danger, but for the silence that reminded her she was alive, that the nightmare had passed. Every once in a while, someone still stopped by, someone who remembered. A young woman with her own story of survival, a veteran who kept her photo in his wallet, a teacher who told his class about the day one of their own stood against fear. They came not for autographs, but for something far deeper, strength. Eleanor never saw herself as strong. She saw herself as necessary. She returned to her garden, planted tomatoes again, read in the evenings, kept her routines. But something had settled in her bones, something she would never be able to explain. Because once you've taken a life, no matter the reason, something inside you shifts. You don't feel bigger. You don't feel powerful. You feel responsible. Not just for what you did, but for what you carry now. And yet, Eleanor carried it with grace. Quiet grace. One summer, on the anniversary of that night, she walked alone to the edge of her property where the blood trail had once stained the earth. The grass had grown back, tall and wild. The trees stood unchanged. She stood for a long while, staring into the woods, remembering everything in painful clarity. Then she said out loud to no one, "I didn't vanish. You did." And with that, she turned around and walked home.